The city of Baghdad shimmered under a relentless sun, the heat pressing against the streets like a living weight. Dust rose from the cracked pavements, swirling in the air with a faint scent of spices, smoke, and oil. In the marketplaces, vendors whispered quietly, avoiding eye contact with soldiers patrolling the alleys. Every glance felt measured, every movement observed. The city had grown used to fear, though fear in Baghdad had never worn a single face, until Uday Hussein emerged from the shadows of power. He moved through the sprawling palaces and government offices like a predator, his footsteps echoing against marble floors, each metallic clang announcing both presence and threat. Even before he spoke, the mere shifting of his gaze could unhinge a man. Those who encountered him learned quickly that charm could be as dangerous as cruelty, and that obedience offered only temporary protection. Uday was not born into violence. It was instilled. As the eldest son of Saddam Hussein, he inherited more than privilege. He inherited an expectation to command, to dominate, and to enforce his father's will. By the 1980s, Baghdad already whispered his name with dread. Stories of his whims and punishments traveled fast through the corridors of power, mixing rumor with fact. Athletes, journalists, bureaucrats, and students all lived in the same uneasy rhythm. Rise with caution, speak with precision, move with care. One could see it in the way men kept their heads lowered as he passed, in the way women clasped hands at the sight of his convoy, in the silence that followed the slam of a heavy palace door. Even the air seemed to carry the weight of expectation, as if the city itself feared the consequences of defiance. Metal doors slammed throughout the compounds, echoing through corridors like gunshots. The sound vibrated against walls decorated with portraits of past leaders and banners proclaiming loyalty. Shouts sometimes followed, sharp and sudden, or perhaps only imagined in the minds of those walking past. People whispered in hushed tones about colleagues who had vanished without explanation. One day a football player might be celebrated for an exceptional performance. The next, he could disappear, leaving behind only the hushed warnings of teammates. Teachers would talk quietly in staff rooms, noting how students seemed to grow paler with each rumor of Uday's presence in public arenas. Even the most mundane activities, buying bread, entering a marketplace, attending a university lecture, became exercises in caution. Nothing was safe, nothing certain. In the palaces, the tension was even more tangible. Uday's presence could be a sudden smile, a flash of charm that masked a darker intent. One moment he would converse amiably, laughing at a joke or complimenting a visitor's attire. The next, a small mistake, a mispronounced word, a delayed gesture, a hesitant glance, could trigger anger. There were whispers that he took particular delight in demonstrating power over those who seemed confident, cutting down pride with calculated cruelty. "Do you know who I am?" he would ask, his voice low, almost playful, yet carrying the weight of inevitability. The question alone was enough to strip the air from a room. Staff and visitors alike learned that compliance, no matter how flawless, could not guarantee safety. The rules were arbitrary, shifting with his moods, yet everyone knew the stakes were absolute. By the mid-1980s, reports of Uday's actions had begun to seep beyond Baghdad's walls. Families in the suburbs spoke in frightened tones, recounting tales of sudden punishments, public humiliations, and arbitrary arrests. Even the children in the streets learned to recognize the black vehicles that often carried him, a convoy signaling not protection but danger. Animals in the palace grounds, horses, dogs, and falcons, were said to respond to his moods, their own behaviors reflecting the terror he could inspire. Every gesture, every smile, every frown carried consequence. The line between fascination and fear blurred as Uday's power grew, creating a city gripped by uncertainty. One never knew when the next act of brutality would unfold, yet it was certain that one would. Whispers spoke of arenas, schools, and offices transformed into stages for intimidation. Those who displeased Uday, whether through failure, perceived disrespect, or sheer misfortune, became lessons for others. The screams, the stories, the sudden absences formed a rhythm that was both invisible and inescapable. Families would huddle together at night, listening for signs that someone had been taken, trying to guess the reason or the fate of the missing. Conversations carried coded language, gestures replaced words, and silence became a tool of survival. Each household, each office, each street carried a story of vigilance, a careful choreography designed to avoid the attention of the young man who had inherited both wealth and menace. Yet, for all his cruelty, Uday was also unpredictable in ways that heightened fear. There were moments when he displayed generosity, inviting musicians, athletes, and artists into his inner circles, only to punish them for imagined slights the next day. The tension was relentless. Hope and despair existed side by side, a constant oscillation in the hearts of those who moved through his orbit. Every smile, every compliment, every order carried double meaning. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, counting the seconds until another unexpected act would reveal the limits of power and the fragility of life in Baghdad. Even with growing awareness of his atrocities, Uday's influence remained untouchable. Political structures, military loyalty, and family protection shielded him from accountability. Rumors of international concern or condemnation had little effect. Within Baghdad, the consequences were immediate, local, and deeply personal. The city became a study in psychological tension, where architecture, routine, and daily sounds became instruments of control. Metal gates, marble halls, and ornate courtyards were both home and theater, shaping perception and reinforcing authority. The faint scent of perfumes, smoke, and heated stone carried the unspoken messages of dominance and threat. As evening fell, the golden light of the sun cast long shadows across the city. The palace doors closed with a metallic clang, echoing like a warning. Inside, Uday moved from room to room, observing, testing, commanding. Outside, families paused in courtyards, ears straining for signs, hearts pounding at the possibility of his presence. Somewhere in the streets, a door slammed, a shout rang out, and someone disappeared without trace. The city of Baghdad trembled under the weight of one man's unchecked power, a darkness that seemed both inevitable and unstoppable. And in that silence, in that tension, the stage was set for what history would later record as the irreversible shadow of Uday Hussein. The story of fear, control, and cruelty was only beginning. The echo of screams haunted the marble halls, reverberating as though the walls themselves remembered every act of cruelty that had occurred within them. The air was thick with the scent of polished stone, mixed with faint traces of sweat, tobacco, and fear. Uday Hussein moved through his domain like a shadow incarnate, his presence a suffocating reminder that safety was never guaranteed. From the moment he rose each day, the city, the palaces, and every person in his orbit existed under his gaze. He was no longer merely the son of Saddam Hussein. He had become an instrument of terror, a living manifestation of unchecked power. Even those who were ostensibly loyal could feel the trembling undercurrents of dread that accompanied his every decision. His cruelty was not random, it was deliberate, precise, and at times almost theatrical. Witnesses later recounted the exacting manner in which he dispensed punishment, each act calibrated to instill maximum fear. In the hidden chambers of his palaces, leather straps, metal chains, and wooden benches awaited those unfortunate enough to cross him. Sometimes the punishments were inflicted for tangible infractions, failure to follow orders, a misaligned uniform, a delayed report. At other times, the cause was invisible, known only to Uday, yet the suffering was real and immediate. Men and women, athletes and officials, even entire families, were subjected to these ordeals, their fear magnified by the unpredictable nature of his whims. The soundscape of his reign was dominated by abrupt slams of doors, shouted orders, and the low, sinister laughter that sometimes followed an act of violence. Silence itself became oppressive, a signal that something was about to occur. A coach might look up from a training field to see soldiers dragging a young player into an unseen chamber. A government clerk might hear a colleague's screams through a wall, a visceral warning of what awaited anyone who faltered. These auditory cues became as significant as any official decree, guiding behavior, shaping compliance, and reminding all that Uday's reach extended beyond the visible corridors of power. In public arenas, his violence took on a performative quality. It was not merely punishment but spectacle, an unmistakable demonstration of authority. Athletes, students, and officials were reminded that any achievement, no matter how laudable, could be overshadowed by the next act of cruelty. He would often appear unannounced at competitions or ceremonies, a smile playing across his face while those around him held their breaths. "Do not fail me," he would say, his voice low yet carrying across the stadium, a single phrase that could turn triumph into terror. Whips of sound, the cracking of leather against flesh, or sudden confinement became lessons that rippled outward, invisible but understood by all who observed. The psychological weight of this environment was relentless. Families whispered in corners of their homes, exchanging coded warnings, careful to avoid any mention of his name. Children learned to recognize the black vehicles that might carry him, eyes widening at the faintest sign of their approach. Employees at offices and palaces developed routines to anticipate his moods, every gesture, glance, and word calibrated to avoid provoking his wrath. Even in his absence, the memory of his presence lingered, a constant, invisible pressure that dictated movement, speech, and thought. Entire families suffered for the perceived errors of a single member. A clerk's late report could bring punishment not just to him but to his siblings, his spouse, his parents. The regime under Saddam had already instilled obedience, but Uday's actions introduced an unpredictable layer of terror. Blurred boundaries between governance and personal vendetta transformed ordinary life into a constant performance, each act weighed, measured, and scrutinized for potential consequence. The machinery of state functioned, but its operators did so under the dual pressures of official duty and personal survival. Uday's whims extended to the smallest details of daily life. A misplaced book, a delayed meal, or a casual comment could ignite anger. Witnesses described how he sometimes demanded apologies in front of crowds, forcing humiliation that would linger long after the incident. At other times, he would summon someone in the middle of the night, taking pleasure in the disorientation and fear that preceded punishment. His ability to blend charm with menace made the environment even more volatile. One could never be certain when leniency or cruelty would arrive, creating an almost unbearable tension that permeated every interaction. Even his closest associates operated in fear. Soldiers, aides, and advisors maintained a facade of loyalty, knowing that failure to anticipate his desires could mean severe retribution. Yet within this terror, Uday maintained a form of charisma, drawing people into his orbit, ensuring that complicity, even in silence, was guaranteed. It was a dangerous equilibrium, maintained through constant surveillance, unpredictable behavior, and the unmistakable knowledge that resistance, even minimal, could be fatal. News of his deeds began to seep beyond Baghdad, carried in hushed tones, letters smuggled out, or stories whispered to foreign journalists. The reputation he cultivated became a symbol of both fear and fascination. Yet within the palace walls, behind closed doors, his actions escalated. Whipping, humiliation, and confinement were no longer mere punishments, they were warnings to an entire nation. The echoes of screams traveled through hallways, through the city, and eventually through history, leaving an imprint that could not be erased. By the late 1990s, Uday's notoriety had reached global attention. Assassination attempts, international scandals, and political scrutiny marked his public life, yet his influence in Baghdad remained absolute. Those within Iraq learned that power, combined with hereditary privilege, could defy accountability. The architectural grandeur of palaces, the intricate bureaucracy of the state, and the omnipresent military ensured that his reign of terror would continue unchecked. The city itself became a theater of psychological warfare, with every street, door, and hallway reinforcing the narrative of dominance. His life ended violently in 2003, yet the consequences of his actions endured. Families bore scars both visible and invisible. Memories carried the weight of trauma that would span generations. Institutions once tasked with governance were tainted by the shadow of arbitrary cruelty, and the social fabric of Baghdad had been reshaped under the pressure of one man's whims. History records Uday Hussein not as a ruler, but as a son whose darkness left an enduring mark on the people of Iraq. The echoes of his terror remained in the city, the marble halls, the whispers of survivors, and the memory of a nation still grappling with the consequences of unrestrained power. Even now, as historians piece together the fragments of his life, the image of Baghdad under Uday's shadow remains vivid. The streets, silent witnesses to fear, carry the memory of a generation forced into caution and silence. The marble halls, polished yet haunted, serve as a testament to the duality of grandeur and cruelty. The personal effects of victims, documents, photographs, and artifacts offer tangible reminders of lives interrupted, of human endurance tested, and of a terror that once seemed limitless. Uday Hussein's legacy, though ended in blood, continues to speak, teaching that power unchecked by law, compassion, or morality can devastate an entire society. The stage was set for history to remember him as he was, not a ruler of nations, but the darkest son of Saddam Hussein, a man whose presence could transform ordinary life into a landscape of fear. And as Baghdad exhaled, weary but enduring, the city carried forward the memory of those shadows, a cautionary echo of the consequences of tyranny concentrated in a single human figure. The story of Uday's reign of fear had reached its grim conclusion, but its lessons and scars would linger long after the palace doors closed for the last time.